The smell of decay always hits hardest after the rain. That morning, it was everywhere, rising from the swampy earth, laced with the sharp sting of concrete dust and the bitterness of rot. Natalie Brooks stood in knee-high boots at the edge of her ruined backyard, watching the last illusion of control slip beneath the muddy waterline. The shouts of Karen Delaney, the self-appointed HOA president, echoed across the soggy street as she berated a city inspector, her once pristine mansion now visibly tilting like a ship caught in slow-motion wreckage. Natalie didn't flinch. Not at the flash flood alerts blaring from a sheriff's cruiser. Not at the chorus of frogs croaking from submerged flower beds. Not even at the absurd sight of a mailbox bobbing past like a funeral float. Because none of this was a surprise. Not really. 3 years ago, Natalie had bought the modest fixer-upper at the end of Marshview Court, a quiet cul-de-sac on the edge of a development in South Florida that prided itself on eco-conscious luxury. Her backyard bordered a winding natural creek, a relic of the land's wilder past, where mangroves clung stubbornly to soft banks and herons waited in silence. For Natalie, who had spent her early career protecting wetlands before burning out on bureaucratic red tape, it was perfect. A redemption arc written in cattails and crickets. The creek wasn't just water. It was memory. It was sanctuary. And it was hers. At least, it had been. Back then, the HOA didn't care much about her end of the street. The real action was up on the ridge, where Karen and her clones lived in boxy McMansions with artificial turf and identical solar panels. Their lives were coordinated, curated, manicured. Natalie's home, older and a little wild, didn't fit their vision. Neither did the creek. The first contact came in the form of a pink envelope wedged into her front door. It smelled like lavender and threats. Natalie opened it over her breakfast eggs and nearly choked on her coffee. The HOA was requesting a site evaluation of her backyard due to unregistered aquatic features. Aquatic features. As if the creek were some inflatable pool she'd forgotten to deflate. At first, she laughed it off. She sent back a curt email with attached documents, old plat maps, environmental overlays, even a copy of the original zoning permit. All of it clearly showed that the creek was a designated natural drainage path protected by county codes. She assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Karen showed up 2 weeks later in lemon yellow athleisure and a visor big enough to shade a picnic table. She looked like someone who drank wine by the quart and considered yoga a religion. "Ms. Brooks," she began, smiling like a dentist about to drill without anesthetic. "We have some concerns." Natalie didn't invite her in. Karen, undeterred, gestured grandly toward the creek. "There are children in this neighborhood. Pets. We can't risk someone falling in." "It's 2 feet deep," Natalie said flatly. "Well," Karen replied, tapping her iPad. "It's about precedent. We can't have one homeowner ignoring aesthetic harmony and ecological balance." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "You want to concrete over a protected wetland for the sake of aesthetic harmony?" Karen blinked, then smiled wider. The violation notices began the next week. They came in waves. First about the unsecured water feature, then about the excessive native vegetation, aka wildflowers, then one accusing her of attracting nuisance wildlife. Natalie nearly framed that one, considering it a badge of honor. She pushed back at first, citing Florida statute this and county code that. But Karen didn't care about the law. She had the HOA behind her, and more importantly, she had time and relentless pettiness. Soon, 3 men with clipboards and unnecessary sunglasses were measuring her backyard, photographing her garden like it was a crime scene. Then came the concrete truck. It arrived at dawn one Wednesday, backing down the alley like a hearse. A man in a vest and hard hat waved it into position, all while ignoring Natalie's protests. They claimed they were improving drainage on common land, that the creek posed flood risk, and they had the approval of the HOA. Natalie screamed. She shoved. She slipped on the wet grass and fell hard, scraping her palm. By the time she got back up, the chute had already dropped, and the thick gray slurry was oozing into the creek like poison. Frogs leapt. Reeds snapped. The water turned silent. Natalie stood there, breathless and muddy, watching her refuge turn into a concrete scar stretching like a wound across her property. Karen watched from the sidewalk, arms folded, wearing that same smug look she probably wore while microwaving fish at work. Natalie stared back and smiled. Let her gloat. Let her think she'd won. Because Karen didn't know what Natalie knew. She didn't know what the land knew. Water remembers. The rains came like a reckoning. By mid-June, the sky over Marshview Court turned the color of tarnished silver, and the storms rolled in from the Gulf with a fury that felt personal. What had once been a gentle Florida wet season now felt biblical. Sheets of water lashed rooftops. Winds bent street signs. And in the heart of it all, the land remembered what it used to be. Natalie sat on her porch with a mug of black coffee cooling in her hand, her boots resting on the porch rail, eyes locked on the gray ribbon that had once been her creek. It no longer babbled or shimmered. It sat there, mute and lifeless, a concrete channel already showing early signs of hairline cracking. She didn't need to be a hydrologist to know what would happen next. The water, denied its natural path, was already backing up. Small puddles on lawns became ponds. Driveways turned to shallow lagoons. And beneath the surface, the soil, saturated and suffocating, was beginning to heave. Karen, of course, saw none of this. Or worse, chose not to see. The HOA newsletter for June featured a full-page spread boasting about eco-forward drainage improvements and highlighted Natalie's neighborhood as a pilot model for HOA-managed water mitigation. It was a lie. All of it. Worse still, the HOA doubled down. New bylaws were passed without a vote. Automatic inspections for properties with high water retention, mandatory landscape alterations, and new fines for improper runoff compliance. Karen framed them as necessary adjustments, but they were clearly targeted. Natalie received 5 violations in a single week, including one accusing her of failing to redirect downspouts, even though hers hadn't changed in years. But Natalie didn't argue. Not this time. She smiled, signed the forms, and quietly filed everything into a growing binder thick with legal citations, environmental codes, photographic evidence, and drone footage. She'd learned patience. The land had taught her that. And now, it was teaching everyone else. It began with a smell. A deep, sour rot that lingered in the air after the second major storm, clinging to the walls of homes and the trunks of mailboxes like mildew in a forgotten basement. By the third storm, water was pooling in places it had never reached before, under crawl spaces, inside garages, between the neatly edged mulch beds Karen had once boasted about during her garden tours. Mr. Holloway's lawn collapsed. The Alvarez family had to sandbag their entire front porch. Mrs. Jensen, the retired art teacher on the corner, woke up to find her basement carpeting soaked and mushrooms sprouting in the closet. And through it all, Karen sent emails. Dozens of them, each more frantic and accusatory than the last. She blamed landscaping crews, rogue homeowners, even the city for not maintaining the storm drains, never once acknowledging the one truth everyone else could see plainly. The flooding started when they filled in the creek. It wasn't just water rising anymore. It was resentment. Neighbors who had once traded gardening tips now exchanged glares. Arguments broke out at HOA meetings, loud, bitter, emotional. Karen tried to regain control, organizing what she called a flood response task force, but it only fueled the fire. Her volunteers mostly handed out pamphlets and fines. They inspected lawns, issued passive-aggressive warnings, and took photos from their SUVs like discount paparazzi. Natalie said nothing. Instead, she walked the neighborhood after each storm with her old Nikon camera around her neck. She documented everything: runoff patterns, clogged drains, yards turned to soup. She flew her drone after the worst downpours, capturing aerial footage of the absurd way water tried to flow uphill against the concrete barriers the HOA had erected. She wasn't the only one noticing. The McKinleys on the corner stopped mowing their lawn altogether in protest. The Patel twins, who had previously been poster children for HOA rule following, began openly criticizing Karen at meetings. But Karen didn't retreat. She advanced. A fresh round of fines went out. Then came a new drainage compliance plan that included a $300 assessment for every home in the lower part of the neighborhood, Natalie's included. It was a breaking point. Natalie knew it when she saw the expression on Mrs. Jensen's face the morning the notice arrived, her lips trembling, fingers shaking as she clutched the paper in disbelief. That same afternoon, the Hendersons ripped out their flower beds in protest. A lawn sign appeared on Birch Street reading, HOA equals hell on asphalt. And still, Karen didn't get it. She thought this was about Natalie. She thought it was personal. And in some ways it was. But not in the way Karen imagined. Because Natalie didn't want revenge. She wanted restoration. That night, Natalie went into the garage and found the old blue folder. It had belonged to her grandfather, the man who'd left her this property, who had once said with quiet conviction, You don't own land. You just take care of it for a while. Inside were the keys to everything. Certified maps from 1971. Original drainage easement permits. A handwritten letter from a county surveyor confirming the creek's protected status. She sat on the cold concrete floor for hours, organizing, cataloging, copying. And when she was done, she opened a private email account and sent an anonymous tip to the local news, the county environmental office, and 3 watchdog groups. Attached were everything: the drone videos, the county records, the HOA violations, the concrete photos. Then she waited. Not for revenge. For gravity. Because what Karen didn't understand, what the HOA could never regulate with fines or bylaws, was that you can't erase the bones of the earth. You can't pave over what was meant to flow. And when it starts moving again, you'd better not be standing in its way. The first official knock came on a Thursday morning. Natalie was pruning her jasmine bushes when 2 white trucks rolled slowly down Marshview Court, their doors stamped with the official seals of Collier County and the Florida Environmental Protection Division. A man in khakis and a wide-brimmed hat stepped out of the first vehicle, unfolding a clipboard. The second truck delivered a younger woman with a surveyor's tripod slung over her shoulder and mud-stained boots. They didn't bother with small talk. "Ms. Brooks," the man asked, his tone professional but already weary from dealing with Florida's endless bureaucracy. "We're here about a suspected unauthorized alteration to a designated wetland easement." Natalie blinked. "Right this way," she said, voice calm. Inside, she poured them black coffee, laid out neatly labeled folders across her dining table, and spoke in clipped, neutral tones, just the facts, just the evidence. No bitterness, no anger, no dramatic monologues. That would come later. For now, she let the document speak. The surveyor's eyes widened more than once. The man in khakis scratched notes furiously. Then they went outside, cameras clicking, tape measures stretching. They took soil samples from the dead creek. They measured the thickness of the concrete pour. The woman crouched by a cracked section near the center and muttered, "Jesus," under her breath. They didn't ask about the HOA. They didn't need to. The evidence was as obvious as the sun above them. By sunset, they were gone. 2 days later, a certified letter was taped to the community center's glass doors. Notice of Environmental Code Investigation. Subject: Suspected unauthorized modification of protected drainage system. Status: Active. Karen's reaction was everything Natalie had expected and more. At the emergency HOA board meeting hastily called that Sunday, Karen stormed in with her usual designer fury: soaked trench coat, perfect blowout ruined by humidity, papers flapping in every direction. Natalie didn't even sit inside. She lingered in the hallway, listening through the thin drywall as Karen raged about malicious slander, media conspiracies, and rogue residents undermining community harmony. But then the projector came on, and everything changed. The city official presenting the findings didn't mince words. On screen, high-resolution images showed the concrete pour in progress. Drone footage circled the clogged storm drains and backup flooding from above. A scanned copy of a 1971 county easement blinked onto the screen next, marked with an unmistakable red border tracing the exact path of the buried creek. Gasps echoed around the room. The quiet kind that only happen when people realize they've been living in a delusion. Karen tried to regain control. It was temporary, she insisted. Just erosion control. The county was aware. But when one of the board members, Janice Holloway, of all people, timidly asked to see a written permit, Karen's voice caught. It was verbal, she said. Silence. That was the moment it shifted. The moment they saw her for what she really was. News spread faster than fungus in a flooded basement. That evening, Channel 4 ran a segment titled, HOA in Hot Water Over Buried Creek Scandal. The anchor smiled politely, but her tone was venomous, reading phrases like reckless negligence and ongoing criminal review, with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for political takedowns. Social media lit up. Natalie watched it unfold in real time. HOA horror stories from across the state surfaced in Facebook groups and Reddit threads. She didn't post, didn't comment, but she watched. She collected screenshots. She made sure everything connected back to one undeniable truth. The HOA had knowingly and illegally tampered with a protected drainage system. And now, the land was retaliating. In the week following the expose, the neighborhood's structural integrity seemed to unravel overnight. The Holloways discovered their garage had sunk an inch on one side. The McMillans' retaining wall collapsed in a shower of wet dirt and broken pavers. Fissures appeared on Maple Ridge Drive, long, jagged cracks that spidered across pavement like lightning scars frozen in concrete. Insurance adjusters began circling, and when the claims came in, they were met with a phrase more terrifying than any HOA fine: claim denied due to policy violations and evidence of prior structural negligence. Without coverage, repairs stalled. Without repairs, homes continued to deteriorate. Without homes, the neighborhood began to die. Karen tried to spin the narrative. She hosted emergency town hall meetings in the community center, passing out bottled water and flashlights like disaster aid. She blamed the city, the previous board, even the weather. She begged for unity. But unity had abandoned her the moment families saw red tag notices stapled to their front doors. Unsafe structure. Unstable foundation. Occupancy restricted pending remediation. Karen's house was the first to get tagged. It felt poetic, somehow. Natalie remained quiet. She filed every notice, recorded every meeting. She even got a small waterproof safe and buried it beneath the old mangrove tree, just in case someone accidentally broke into her home looking for evidence. But more than anything, she waited. Because the final blow wasn't going to come from a city official or a journalist. It was going to come from the land. And it was close now. Natalie could feel it in her boots when she walked the yard, the soft give of soil that hadn't seen real oxygen in months. She could see it in the way fences leaned like drunks and sidewalks buckled like blistered skin. She could hear it in the tension, neighbors whispering at the mailbox, watching Karen from behind curtains, listing their homes in secret. The HOA was rotting from the inside out. And Karen? Karen was still trying to find people for having garden gnomes. That's when Natalie knew it was almost over. It ended not with a bang, but with the slow, grinding moan of foundations giving way. The final storm arrived unannounced. There were no warnings, no radar alerts, no time for sandbags or emergency emails. The sky darkened in a matter of minutes, turning the late afternoon into premature twilight. The rain came fast, sideways and brutal, slamming against homes already gasping for structural breath. Gutters overflowed before the first inch of water had time to drain. Storm drains choked on debris and despair. And then the earth gave up. Natalie stood at her front window as it happened, the porch light flickering from the strain on the grid. Across the street, the Delaney house, the two-story McMansion Karen had once declared the jewel of Marshview Court, groaned audibly, almost mournfully, before the right half sank 6 inches into the muck. The front columns cracked first, splitting with a sound like bones breaking. One collapsed entirely, taking the faux Greek portico with it. The front lawn peeled away next, slipping into the street in a wave of mud that engulfed a neighbor's Corolla. Natalie didn't look away. She watched as Karen burst through the front door, still in her robe, wading through brown water with her arms raised, as if trying to halt the collapse through sheer indignation. Her screams were drowned out by the wind. Her feet slipped in the muck. She went down hard, rose again soaked and staggering, and shouted at no one in particular, pointing toward Natalie's house like it was somehow to blame. But nobody was listening. Neighbors were too busy hauling children and pets into SUVs. Some were crying. Others moved like ghosts, too stunned to react. A few filmed from under umbrellas, their phones trembling as they captured what they couldn't quite process. Their perfect little HOA-run paradise, imploding into the earth. Natalie made no move to film. She didn't need to. Everything that mattered had already been recorded, archived, and backed up in 3 different cloud storage systems and 1 fireproof safe. By morning, the red tags had multiplied. A total of 17 homes were deemed uninhabitable. 6 more were under investigation. 3 families left that very day, their trunks dragging through the sludge as they pulled away without goodbyes. Karen tried to make one last stand. She held a press conference, in the rain, naturally, standing in front of the sagging community center with a laminated statement clutched like a shield. She declared herself a victim of a smear campaign, blamed false environmental claims, unreliable satellite data, and targeted harassment. No one believed her, not even the board. Half had already resigned. The other half wouldn't return her calls. When Channel 4 aired the footage of Karen's speech next to drone shots of her collapsing house, they didn't even bother with commentary. They just let the footage roll, unedited, raw, devastating. It spoke for itself. Within a week, the insurance denials started arriving. Without coverage, no homeowner could afford to stay. Property values plummeted. Realtors refused to list homes in Marshview Court. The HOA's budget hemorrhaged legal fees. A class action lawsuit began forming in the background like thunder on the horizon. And then came the emergency vote, held in the gutted shell of the community center. Under flickering fluorescent lights, a handful of remaining residents gathered and did what no one had dared to propose before. They voted to dissolve the HOA. No debates, no objections, just hands raised slowly, tiredly, one by one. Karen tried to object, claimed the motion was illegal, but no one stopped her from speaking because no one was listening. The final Treasury report was read aloud. Over $2 million in projected legal exposure, $78.32 remaining in operational funds. And then, with a single pen stroke, Marshview Court's HOA ceased to exist. Karen was last seen dragging boxes of shredded documents into the back of a borrowed trailer, her once beloved robe now torn and stained with mud. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. She left the same way she'd ruled, alone, defiant, and in denial. But the story didn't end there. Because when the storm cleared and the neighborhood was quiet again, hollow but not hopeless, something strange happened. People started walking. They walked past their ruined lawns and cracked sidewalks. They walked into Natalie's yard, where the concrete scar of the old creek still shimmered like a wound. And they asked questions. Not accusations. Not demands. Just simple questions. What was here before? What can we do now? So Natalie showed them. She pulled out the maps, the old permits, the drone footage. She walked the property with city engineers and environmental consultants. She applied for restoration grants. And when the county approved $250,000 in wetland rehabilitation funds, she didn't keep it for herself. She invited everyone to help. And they came. They showed up in boots and gloves, with shovels and wheelbarrows. They tore up the concrete. They carried out the debris. They redug the channel by hand, shaping it with river stones and native grasses. They planted willows and hibiscus. They restored the land not with blueprints, but with intention. And the creek returned. Slowly, shyly, like a guest who wasn't sure if they were still welcome. The water trickled, then flowed, then danced over the rocks again, alive with dragonflies and promise. Children played near it now, watched carefully, respectfully. The frogs returned. The air smelled like earth instead of mildew. Natalie sat beside it every evening, feet in the water, listening to the land exhale. Then one morning, with no ceremony or fanfare, she planted a sign where the creek curved into her property. A simple wooden post, hand-carved and weather-sealed, bearing 3 words in bold, quiet lettering. Nature always wins. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't revenge. It was truth. The swamp never really leaves you, not if you've lived through it. It lingers in the folds of memory, in the soft give of damp soil beneath your boots, in the smell of wet bark after a summer rain. For Natalie Brooks, it became more than a backdrop. It became a monument. Months had passed since the last red tag had been peeled from a front door. Marshview Court had changed, though not in the ways Karen Delaney had envisioned. The lawns weren't perfectly edged anymore. The fences didn't match. No more synchronized Halloween decorations or passive-aggressive newsletters about lawn height. But there was life again. Real life. Where concrete had once smothered the land, wildflowers now bloomed defiantly. Milkweed for butterflies. Pickleweed for pollinators. Willow trees lined the reformed creek, their roots knitting into the soil, anchoring the neighborhood with something stronger than rebar, purpose. Natalie had become, reluctantly, something of a steward. Not a leader. Not a president. She refused any title, any committee, any formal role. But people came to her still. They asked what to plant, how to reinforce the banks, how to keep the water flowing without disrupting the ecosystem. She answered when she could. When she couldn't, she researched. She learned. She taught. Quietly. Without meetings. Without fines. The land did most of the teaching anyway. Even now, it offered reminders. The house 2 doors down, abandoned during the worst of the flooding, was torn down entirely. In its place, a native garden, built by volunteers, with a hand-painted bench facing the creek. Children sat there after school, tossing stones into the water, chasing frogs under the shade of new trees. Another house, once owned by Karen's most loyal ally, was sold to a young couple, teachers from upstate who planted a vegetable garden in the side yard and hosted weekend potlucks open to all. The air smelled of grilled corn and laughter. The ghosts of HOA rulebooks had long since been buried under compost and wild myth. Karen herself was a fading memory. Some claimed they'd seen her at a rest stop in Georgia, arguing with a clerk over bottled water. Others said she'd taken a job in Arizona, trying to start a new planned desert community. But no one really cared. Her name still drew eye rolls at the community coffee table near the trailhead, but even that faded with time. Her house? Still empty. Overgrown. A collapsed porch, sagging shutters, vines crawling through shattered windows like the land had decided to take back every inch she ever claimed. Natalie passed by it sometimes on her walks, but she never stopped. The house had become its own kind of warning, a relic of arrogance, a monument to forgetting what cannot be paved over. The county eventually sent a formal acknowledgement. A letter, signed and sealed, affirming the legal recognition of the Marshview Creek Restoration Zone. It came with a small grand extension and a plaque, which Natalie politely declined to install. Instead, she kept the envelope in the same old file where her grandfather's maps and letters still lived. The documents had grown yellow at the edges, but they were no less powerful. They had outlasted the storm, the HOA, and the bureaucracy that tried to erase them. Some evenings, Natalie still sat by the creek. She would bring a folding chair, the same one from her earliest days in the house, though it had a new coat of paint and a few replacement bolts. A fishing rod leaned beside her, not for catching, really, just for the ritual. The burble of water over stones, the chorus of frogs, the occasional splash of a turtle, all of it part of the symphony that had once been silenced and now sang louder than ever. And always, nearby, stood the sign. Nature always wins. People still stopped to read it. Some nodded. Some chuckled. A few took photos. But Natalie didn't need the affirmation. She had watched the land reclaim itself, had witnessed how something as ancient and humble as a creek could rise against concrete and paper and power. She had learned that resistance isn't always loud, that sometimes the most unstoppable force in the world is patience, and that vengeance isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's just water, slow, unyielding, and eternal. One morning, a young girl, about 10, with tangled curls and dirt-smudged cheeks, walked up to Natalie as she was trimming the hibiscus. "Did you really save the creek?" she asked. Natalie paused, then smiled. "No," she said. "The creek saved itself. I just got out of the way." The girl nodded solemnly, then ran off to join her friends by the bend in the water, their laughter echoing through the reeds. Natalie looked after them for a moment, then went back to her work, fingers in the dirt, hands steady. She had rebuilt her peace, and this time it would endure.